Hi, hello. So in this video we are going to see how to create a special type of view component. In the previous video we saw to create a standalone view component, which means that it's a component I can use on a view on its own, that is living on its own, does not depend on anything. But we have a different type of view component. For example, if you have a record editor, here pointing on the test, record definition. And here you can have some view components that can only live inside the record editor. So for example, I can use this text field and I can map it to one of the field from the record definition. But I cannot just use this field and try to put it, for example, inside the container. And inside this container outside the record editor. So this is a special type of field, which is a record field view component. And that's what we are going to do. We are going to create one. So for that, first of all, what we need to do is ensure that our Rx SDK home environment variable points to the SDK. So we are going to do echo Rx SDK home. And we can see that it points to 2105. So you need to be sure that it points to the right path in your SDK. So if you want to see what's inside, you should point inside this folder. You should have your client lib, sample, and standard lib folder. This is for 2105. So here, once you're done, that you set the path correctly to Rx SDK home. So if you want to do that, you can just do this command on Windows. On Mac, it would be export Rx SDK home. It would be a bit different. So once you are ready, you have to go inside the web app folder, which is here in the bundle web app folder, like we did for the action and like we did for the view component, to actually generate the schematic for this record field view component. So like we did with the action and view component, we are going to use a schematic, which is pretty much like a templating system. If you are used to Angular, you know that you can generate quite easily a component or service typing ngg component or ng generate service, for example. So you can do the same thing with our objects, like we did with action and view component. So if you don't have Angular CLI, you can just type yarn run ngg rx field view component, and as name, so we use sample component before, so we are going to use sample field component. And if you want to see what's going to happen, but without actually creating or modifying anything, you can end by dry run, which I'm going to do. So here, for example, you would create a bunch of fields and update this field, so which is the library. So I guess to declare the module. So everything seems to be okay. I'm just going to remove this dry run to actually generate the files. So if we go here, we can see that it created a folder with a bunch of files that kind of looks like the ones we have for our view component, and they actually the structure looks pretty much exactly the same. And this file has been modified. So if we go on Git, and if we see the difference, you can see that we imported from our registration module, the main module, and we just imported it inside the main library. So that sounds perfect. So like a view component, we have two sections. We have one for design and one for runtime. Exactly as a view component, the design is the code that is going to be executed in View Designer, so design time. And the runtime is a code that is going to be executed when we are going to execute the view. So for example, if I do something like this, if I put a value here, And if I preview this view, here is what I have. So this will be, the code will be executed at runtime, and the code would be executed at design time. So we have two sides. I would really recommend you to look at the view component tutorial. So you will see the difference between view component and record field view component. So anyway, let's begin by the registration of our sample field component. So in registration module, and you can see that it's pretty much the same thing as what you have for the view component. So we are going to register our record field view component. So the type is the name, the internal name. So by default, it's really recommended to just use the values that we generate for you. And the reason why is to avoid collision with BMC object or other developers object. So it's prefixed using your bundle. So for example, example sample app here, and then the name of your view component. The name is actually just a label that will appear inside the palette. So I could just say something like sample field component. You can change the icon if you want to. And the group is going to be the one in which it will appear inside the palette. So it will appear, for example, under here. So here you would have sample field component. Those two parameters are extremely important for record field view component. It says that you can drag and drop this view component inside the record editor, which is required because it's going to depend on it. And here it says in what you can insert it. And this one is pretty specific to record field view component, and same thing. You can say that, okay, you can include it or drag and drop it inside the record editor. So by the way, you can use that, for example, for a standalone view component. You can use this option. So for example, if I take here a star rating, which is a standalone view component, that doesn't need a record editor, I can drag and drop it outside, or I can drag it inside a record editor, which can be useful sometimes. So this parameter can be used both for view components and record field view components. This one should be used only for record field view components, and both of them are required for record field view component. So as we saw for the view component, the component factory and design component factory are just ways to declare both your components that are going to be at runtime and design time. So this one will be for the component, for the Angular component that is at runtime, and the design component factory is going to be for the component at design time. Because at design time, we are going to have one Angular component to display something, and at runtime, for example, it would be something like that. So then you have your design component model that is going to be here, the design model.ts, which is going to be in charge, exactly like the view component, for declaring the input parameters, output parameters, the validation. So that's what is going to be used. By default, I would, and same thing for the bundle ID, this is your bundle ID, come example sample app. So it's highly recommended not to touch anything for those parameters. By default, they should be already perfect. Then here is something that is different from the view component and is very important. As you can see here, in input parameters, I have only message, in this case, in what is declared. And it's very important to understand that because this field is going to be linked to a field in the record definition, exactly like the text field, here we are going to select a field name. So here, for example, a text field, which is description. That means that a lot of the properties like disabled, hidden, these kind of things are already handled by the base version. So we are really going to extend a base component, a base record field component. So a lot of the properties are actually inherited from the base version, from the base component. So that's why here you only declare the specific input parameters for your record field view component. So for example, it could be a color. If you want to display, I don't know, if you have a star rating and if you want to display the stars in a specific color, so it's a property that does not exist in a base field or something like that. But for example, you do not define the field ID, the label, if it's disabled, hidden, the value, and the styles. Everything comes with the base component. So if you want to declare some input properties, what you would need to do is extend those base field property. So that's why we are using Rx base field properties, that is BMC, and we are concatenated with an array of our own input parameters. So if I go here, you would see that it's a list of component property descriptors, and we have already a lot of input parameters already defined, and those are the properties. So when we generate the schematic for you, you can look at here what kind of information you do not need to declare, because they are already here. So that's one very important difference with a view component. And you need to be sure, once again, I want to emphasize on that, you really need to extend the Rx base field properties. If you just put something like this, then your code is not going to work correctly. So be very careful when you want to generate a record field view component. Just be sure that you are extending the Rx base field properties. So once we are done with the registration, you can see here that we have an input parameter. Maybe just let's look at what's going to happen when we just deploy the bundle. So as usual, I'm going to run maven install -p-export-p-deploy to take the code that is remote, so the view that I'm just creating, and then I'm going to deploy the bundle, so with my updated code. So I'm going to pause the video, and I'm going to resume the video when the bundle is deployed. So here the bundle has been deployed successfully. So let's go back to Innovation Studio. I'm going to refresh my view so I can see my new component, and you can see here that oh, this is not the right one. So here it's under sample application, so it's not really nice. The group should be this one. So let's take the sample field component, and you can see I cannot drag and drop it outside the record editor. It needs to be inside the record editor. And as you can see, it's a bit different from a text field. It looks like a text field, and that's normal because our example is supposed to mimic the text field. But if you click on it, you will see that it has some interesting properties. So first of all, you can see that from the same part in general, we have exactly the same options. We have the field name, the display label, the value, disable, hidden, CSS classes. We have exactly the same properties inside general. And if you remember in the code, inside properties, technically we only define message as input properties. But like I explained, because we extend Rx base field properties, which are these ones, we don't have to worry about anything that is out of the box inside the base field. So, but you can see here in custom settings, I have message, the one that I've set up here. So, and you can see that here we have no field selected. So I'm going to say that it's going to map the description field. So both of them are actually matching the record field description from the record definition. So if we go here, we have test, and it's going to map this field. That means when I'm going to enter a value inside this field, for example, it would do exactly the same thing as if I entered in a BMC out of the box matching on description. So we are going actually to see that. So we are going to have an action button. We are going to use save, name it save, add an action, save, and we are going to save the record editor. Then we are going to have container with 2 columns. We are going to have a grid to display the list of our tests. We just don't need the display ID and the modified date, we need the ID. And I'm going to display to select only one row. And then here I'm going to have a record editor in edit mode this time, pointing on test. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to say this is for edit. And this one I'm going to add the name, this is for create. So I can see the difference during the data dictionary. I'm going to show that later. And the record ID is the row I'm going to select in my grid. So here it's going to be record grid, first selected row, and the ID. So that's why I added ID inside the grid. And I want to display, of course, the description. So here I'm going just to use the one that is out of the box. And what I can do is take my version, I mean the version done by BMC, and map it to description as well. And we will see what is the difference. So we need a message because it's required. And you can see that we have a validation for both of them because nothing has been entered for the message. So I said that in the record editor we set a name. Why is it important? Well, both of this record editor point to the same record definition. So here, for example, if I do save, it would be, if I didn't have this label, I would just have record editor test and record editor test. So which one is the right one to save? When you add the name, you will know, you will have record editor, the record definition name, and then the name that you have set. So it's much easier to see what is what. So here everything is good. I'm going to use a refresh action to say I'm going to refresh the grid. And we need to set a message. And you can see here that we have a little message to say that the configure message will be displayed here. So whatever I set here should be displayed here. So here I'm going to say foo. And here the message will be bar. I'm going to save. And I'm going to preview this view. So here you can see it's displayed 2 times, and here we have some kind of weird message. It's because this is a work in progress in our SDK. It's not something you will have in the final version of the SDK. So we will actually fix that. But don't worry about it. So you can see here that we have foo, and so the message that we define here. And let's see what happens when we type something. So you can see that when I'm typing something on the description field, it's actually, this field is actually listening to it and showing the same thing. And here, the same thing happens here. That is the reason why, is because both of those fields are pointing on description. So let's see what happens when I remove this one. I refresh. So here I don't have any out of the box BMC field. And I'm going to say here is the value. And I'm going to save. So you can see here that the record instance has been saved. And the value, here is the value has been saved inside description, which means that our record field view component actually saved the value inside the description field. So that means it works. And here we are in edit mode. We can see that we have bar, and we can see that both in the BMC version and the one from the schematics, we have the same value, so everything is working properly. So now let's see what happens when our record editor is not in edit mode, which is the case by default, but when it's on a read-only state, because we have two different modes for a record editor. So here we are going to be in read mode. So let's refresh. You can see here that we have the values, and by default here we display just a version that is pretty much read-only, so it's a bit more condensed, but we can switch to edit mode back and forth. So in both cases we have a correct version of our record field view component both in read and edit mode. So when you create your custom record field view component, it's very important to have both versions as well. One that will be displayed in read mode and one in edit mode. So of course it's not a different component, it's just that we'll see later in the runtime code that is just a different way to display the data. We'll know when it's in read state or not in read state. So now we can see that this is coming out of the box. So let's see how it works in the code. So we saw the registration module. Let's begin by the design time. So exactly like in the view component, we have an interface, and this interface only shows input parameters that are specific to your record field view component. In our case, it's message. We are not going to list the out-of-the-box default inherited field like field ID, label, and so on. Only the ones that are specific to our view component. So here it's message. You can see that the difference with a view component is we have two interfaces, one for design time and one for runtime. The difference is the kind of interface it extends. So here is our interface. Then we have design model that is in charge of the validation, declaring input parameters, declaring output parameters. And you can see already that it looks much simpler than the version that we had for the view component. And the reason why is a lot of things don't need to be declared in a record field view component. So you can see first of all that we are not extending the same field, the same object. Here if we go here we are extending the view designer component model, and here we are extending the base record editor field design. So you need to be careful not to copy paste, for example, a code that would be working for a view component inside a record field view component, because there are some major differences. The first of them is field resource types. Field resource types will tell the system which field can be mapped to this record field view component. So here it's character. So what is that? So if you remember, when I drag and drop my sample field component in my record editor, I could select a field name. And here I can see 3 of them. But in my record definition, I have way more. I have created date, modified date, notifier listening, status. And here I have only 3 of them. And the 3 of them share a common feature, which is 3 of them are text. So assignee, description, of course not the ID because you cannot change the ID. So this command field resource types is going to tell what are the fields that can be mapped to your record definition. So if we look at how it works, for example, for something a bit different, which is star rating field that I created, you can see here that we cannot bind it to anything because nothing is matching the field type. And the reason it cannot match the field type is because it should be a number. So let's see, I'm going to put an integer for star rating. So this one is an integer. You can actually use as well floating, maybe not a floating, a decimal. I'm going to add a decimal. And here, if I refresh my view, and if I drag and drop star rating field, you can see that I have the choice between the integer and the decimal. So technically you could have multiple types. Here you can have type number 1, and you can say that you support a character, and then, for example, a decimal. So that means that in the list we would display the field from the record definitions, which are text, and decimal as well, which is not the case we want here. So let's remove this. So that's already a big difference with a view component. Then this is just the input parameters we have inside the constructor. You can see that it's much simpler than what we have inside a view component. In the view component, there were a lot of methods that were not called automatically. For example, when we set the settable properties, when we set the input parameters, when we set the output parameters, when we set the validation. As you can see here, the only thing that we have in the constructor is actually the validation. So we validate the custom properties. So we will see that later. But as you can see here, there are a lot of methods that are called automatically. So like in the view component, we have get initial properties. And what it will do is setting the default values if we don't have anything in it. So here message. It will apply the current values, so the values that are saved in the view definition. So here, for example, it would be foo. But you can see here another difference with view component is we have a third party. And here the third party is the values that are saved for the base fields. Because as you remember, we have some input parameters like field ID, label, disable, hidden value, and styles that are set, but not by us. So when we call or get initial properties, we have to set the default value for our custom input parameters, set the current value for the custom input parameters, but also, of course, set the current value for the inherited parameters. So this method is called automatically, and it does pretty much exactly the same thing as what it does for the view component. The only difference is this one. We add the current values for inherited input parameters. Then we have the inspector configuration, and the inspector configuration is building the input parameters. So before in a view component, we had pretty much this method where we declared the input parameters and we called it inside the constructor. Here we have a getInspectorConfig method that will be called automatically, so you don't need to call it from the constructor. And it's really recommended not to touch anything about it because you need to get the inspector configuration from the inherited object, so which will contain the field ID, the values, and everything like that. And we need to append our own input parameters. So here we are going to get the inspector configuration. We are going to extend it inside build inspector config. So we are going to build ours, pretty much exactly the same as for view component. So we have a section which is custom settings with a list of controls, so a list of input parameters. And in our case, we just have a message which is type expression form control component, which means that here we have an expression builder. If we had text expression form control component, it would be displayed as an input field. So if you want to change the type, you could put form control component and see the different values that you have. So for example, it would be text form control component if you wanted to. Of course, the options would be different. You wouldn't need the data dictionary and the operators and required. So it would be something like that, much more simple. But in our case, we don't want that. We want an expression. So to have an expression builder. So like I explained for the view component, when you have an expression form control component, the options are very important and need to map this interface. And you need to implement both the data dictionary and operators. You don't need to worry too much about those two ones. You can just copy the values. They are supposed to declare what will appear in data dictionary and operators, which are what is going to happen here and here for the operators and the data dictionary. By default, you have pretty much anything you want and need, so you don't need to change anything. So those two values, don't worry too much about it. So we have a tooltip. We have a flag to say if the field is required or not. And this is the name of the input parameter, so which needs to match this one. And this is just the label that will appear here, message. So here we have our label. Because we have is required, it appears in red. Here is our tooltip, and here is our expression builder. So the really important part as well is how to add our custom input parameters to the ones that are already defined with the field ID and so on. So here in command code, you can see that here is the object that comes, for example, for the base version of our object, inherited object. So we have an inspector section configs. Instead of it, we have a general section. And in this general section, we have, for example, the field ID, where we can select the field name that will contain some options. So pretty much what you have here. So we have already one section. So here, to make things simpler, we are going to take the default inspector config, and we are going to take this inspector section configs, which is an array, and we are going to push our own version. So basically, we are going to create another section. So here we have one section general, one section component settings. So this way it's easier. If you wanted to add these input parameters inside general, it would be a bit more troublesome, because you would have here, you would say how you can do that. So you would have to take the first controls, because here it's an array, right? So you would have to take the first item of the array, which would be general, go inside the controls, and then push this object, for example, inside of it. So you would have to do something like that. So that wouldn't be very user-friendly. That's less user-friendly, let's say. So the easy way is just to create another section and add your custom input parameters inside this section. Then we have the validation. So as we say earlier, in the constructor we have this code that is going to run each time the input parameters are modified. It's going to take the validation issues from your custom input parameters, and it's going to pass them to the list of existing validation issues. So if we go here we are in the model or input parameters, so we only need to validate the custom input parameters. So here's a message. So here you can add the validation message, and you return your own validation issues, which is just an array. So as you can see, it's actually a bit simpler than for a view component, because most of the validation, most of the declarations are not needed because are already done in a base record field design. And if you don't have any input parameters, any custom input parameters, it's actually even much simpler, because you would do something like this. And here you can just remove whatever is not needed in your code. So you wouldn't need to do special validate custom properties and these kind of things. But in our case, we want an input parameter. And as you can see, there is no output parameters, because it does not really make sense. It does not really make sense because you are actually tapping into a field name description which belongs into the record editor. So here, if you wanted to say that this value is going to match the value that you are going to enter, so let's do that. We're going to say that it's going to be description. You can see that you are not tapping into the component itself, but we are tapping inside the record editor. So here, let's remove this. Let's refresh. So here I'm going to select a record editor, of course. And here I'm going to type something. So we didn't say that this value was mapped to an output parameter of the record field view component. We just say that the value is tied to the record editor definition field. So we don't really need specific output parameters, because we are going to use the output parameters from the record editor. So that's why we usually don't have output parameters for a record field view component. So let's clean up this one. So here we are done with the design model. So let's see what else we have. We have, of course, a component. And this component is what is displayed in the canvas. So it's just using an adapt Rx text field, which is an adapt object. And this adapt object is the one we use, exactly the one we use actually internally to create the text field. So you can see that you have the paragraph, the configured message will be displayed here, and the adapt Rx text field component. So if we go back to view designer, that's exactly what we have. We have the paragraph, and then we have the field. So nothing special. But the interesting part is, if you remember when we did the view component, we didn't pass any values. We just had an icon, right? When we created the view component. So we had something like this, very simple. So here, when you change something, so for example, the display label, it reflects in design time. So the interesting part in a record field view component is you have access to the model of your base record field. So because you access the model, you can use this model later here. So that's how when I type something in the label, the input parameter changes, and here it's an observable, so I'm getting the value. Same thing for is required. So here if I say that it's not required, but it's the description field is required, but you can see that the assignee field is not required, so the is required disappeared, and here it comes back. So that's one way to get access to the input parameters inside the design time component. So here it's very simple. I just have my model. I have my sample field component design component. I have an Angular module that goes with it, with my sample field design time component. And this module here is the module that is imported there. So nothing special, it's really a standard Angular component, standard Angular module. So now let's focus on the runtime side. So on the runtime side, what do we have? We just have a component and a module. So let's get rid of the module. So we just have a module. This module is going to be imported in the main registration module, which is here. So nothing fancy. And here we just declare and export the sample field component, which will be this one. So let's have a look at the component. The component in itself has two interesting parts. So you remember that I told you that we have two states, right? We have one that is edit and one that is read. And that's exactly what you have here in the code. So you have two ng containers, one with a Rx read-only field, which is a BMC field, and one with an adapt Rx text field that we just saw earlier, which is an input field. And the condition is about ng if it's in read state. So we are going to display this container, and if it's not in read state, we are going to display this one, this ng template. And as you remember, here we have a bug. So we have 2 times foo and 2 times bar when we are in edit mode. It works fine with read mode, doesn't work fine with edit mode. So we are going to fix that later. And I mean, you can already see why it's not working properly. But anyway, so we have two versions, one for read, one for edit. And inside of it, you can see that we have a label, we have get display value, and we have a couple of information. So let's see what is inside the logic. And you can see that it is a major change with a view component. It is like 28 lines, which is much smaller than a view component. The only things we have is onConfig initialized. And you can see that the other difference is we are extending base record editor field component, which is different than the version that we use for a view component, which is base view component. So we are not using base view component, we are using base record editor field component. So a lot of things are different. So we have a constructor with nothing special in it. And then we have this onConfig initialized. So what does that do? Actually, you can see here that we are just setting the max length, which is here, which is the number of characters you can type. For example, if your field can only handle 10 characters, well, it would be more user-friendly to only let the end user type 10 characters rather than putting, for example, an infinite number of characters. So onConfig initialized is going to be called each time the configuration has been modified. And the configuration, what does it have inside? It has our input parameters. So as you can see, I don't need to worry about the field ID, the value, the label, and so on. Everything is taken care of. So if you look at here, you can see that in my adapt Rx text field, I have a form control, I have label is required, is disabled. So where does that come from? Because I don't have here a variable name label, right? I don't have anything. Well, label comes inside the base record field component. You have a lot of properties that are inherited from this component. So here the label is actually the value that has been set in the view designer. So I don't need to worry about pretty much anything. I don't have to worry about the value. The value comes from it. So you have actually the form control. The form control is inherited as well, as you can see, from base record editor component. Same thing for is required, for is disabled. Here we are label or translated label, which is not correct. So we'll fix later. And you can see something interesting is here we have in read state, and that will tell us in which state is record editor. Same thing, it's inherited. And here for the value, you have a method that will give us the value. So you don't tap into value directly, so you don't do something like this, because it's not even accessible to you. It's you need an accessor for it, so you need to use get display value. And actually, if you wanted to change it later, you could use something like this. You could use set feed value. So here you would have some input parameters. So you would have the value for it, for the field. So here, if I wanted, I could have set field value, and it would set the value to hello world. So in this example, we don't really need that. We would see an example how to do that in the library I did, and when we do the code explanation. But here, it's much simpler. So you can see here that we have, like I said, the label, form control is required, is disabled, everything is inherited. And we display our message. Our message is a custom input parameters, and it's coming from config. Config is coming from the config, which is also inherited from base record editor field component. So here we are getting our message, we are displaying our message. So as you can see, very simple. So now let's try to debug and see what happens, and see if we can fix our code. So let's go to here, the web app folder. And if you remember, we did exactly the same thing for action and for view component. We have a way to debug the code using ngserve. So if you are used to debugging Angular application, well, it's exactly the same thing. So the command is still, though, a tiny bit different. So we would use the same command we used for view component and action, npm start --API host, and pointing to the domain or the IP of your Innovation Studio server. So you don't need to give the 8008 port, it will assume that it's 8008. So I'm going to start this command inside the web app folder. It's going to build the code, and it's going to serve it. So I'm going to pause the video and resume it when the serve is ready. Okay, the ngserve is ready. It launched the server on localhost 4200, and it actually launched a page on localhost 4200. So we do exactly the same thing as we did for the view component. We just take whatever is coming after Helix, we paste it after localhost 4200. It asks us to log in again because it's not the same session. And we can see our view component here. So, and everything is working as normal. So we can do, of course, the same thing for the design time as well, as we saw earlier. So we can do this. Take whatever is coming after Helix. And we are inside View Designer, and we could debug our design time as well. But we don't want to do that here. We just want to fix this foo and remove this text. So why do we display 2 times the foo? Well, I mean, it's a pretty easy fix to do. You can see that we have an ngIf that says only display this field if we are in read state, but we don't do the same thing for the paragraph. So we could do something like this. That should be enough. So now it should build the new files. The page should have actually been refreshed automatically. And you can see here that we have only one foo. So let's do the same thing for the required. Here I guess it's not exactly the same, I mean the good message. So what we can do, but we're not going to do that, we could do, here we could put just required, like here. So it needs to be a string. Required. Actually, it would be parentheses required. So we can do something like that. Okay. Or we can try to leverage translation as well. So here the key is obviously missing. So we could go inside the localization strings and we could create an entry for that. So it would be a string and then the value would be required. Okay, it's a JSON, so it needs to have correct. So here we have a common required label. So here it built successfully. Let's see what we have now. Oh, we need to change as well back in the code. So here we have our com BMC RC directly on common required label translated, and you can see that it's correctly displayed now, required. So here let's change that because this is a BMC string. So let's put com.example dot sample app dot it's good enough. So let's put this key and let's see what happens if I don't change anything else. So I still have my wrong label, so I'm going to go here, I'm going to use my new key, I'm going to save. And I have my required. So, I mean, in this video, we saw a lot of things. We saw how to create a record field view component, which is a different type of view component. We saw how the design time and the runtime are working. We saw to debug them, design time and runtime. Actually, only runtime, but I mean, you got the idea. It's exactly the same thing. And we saw as well how to leverage the localization. So you can add your own strings. So if you want to see how you can translate inside into other locales, there will be a video about that, about localization, but you could look already inside our docs. You would need to run a maven command to export those strings inside the server. After that, you can download them, localize them inside of our locales, and import them inside the bundle later, but that would be another video.